Today, I want to continue with the third installment of our series entitled Giving God's Way. In our time together last week, I said to you that the word tithe is never mentioned in reference to giving in the New Testament church. Never. In all the passages where the church gives, there is no mention at all anywhere of tithing. And we said that not only is God's pattern for giving not tithing in the New Testament, it isn't even tithing in the Old Testament. It never has been tithing, and it never will be tithing. Well, as we continue with our series today, I want to unpack further the scriptural teaching on giving in both the Old and New Testaments as we learn how God wants us to give the money He provides to us as part of our personal stewardship in managing our financial resources. Now, we can divide the history of giving into three sections: before the time of Moses or prior to Moses; secondly, between Moses and Jesus; and then third, from Jesus to our present time today. Now, we need to understand as well that in all three periods of history, giving falls into two basic categories. And these two categories are what we call free will giving and required giving. Free will giving and required giving. You see, the Bible requires in all three of these periods of history that we are to give our money. We are required to give to the Lord, and the Bible instructs us to do that faithfully. Secondly, in all three of these periods of history, it also speaks of giving free gifts, or what we call free will giving. So these three periods of history are three distinct periods of time. In all three of them, the same pattern of giving is taught and practiced. There is no difference. So today, let's look at the first period of history of how free will giving was done before Moses came on the scene. Now, let me explain what I mean. In Genesis chapter 4, we have the first offering given to God. And this very first offering that was given to him was from Cain and Abel. And the interesting thing about this is that it was a voluntary offering. It was free will. It simply says this in verse 3. In the course of time, Cain brought some of the fruits of the soil as an offering to the Lord. Now, notice there is no command from God that they had to do this, that they had to bring an offering. God didn't tell them specifically to do that. At least it's not recorded in Scripture that he did. It just says that in the process of time, it came to pass that they did it. It was voluntary. Both of them brought an offering. It was a free choice on their part. And we're told that on his part, Cain gave from the fruit of the ground, which we know was not what God had asked for. And it was not what Abel brought. Abel brought an animal sacrifice. And you'll remember that Cain's offering was displeasing to God from the fruit of the ground. You see, there was no law about how much they were to give, but apparently God had revealed to them what they were to sacrifice. And it was to be an animal sacrifice. But there's no instruction on what percentage they were to offer. There's no indication of that anywhere. But what we do know is that they were prompted to give of their own initiative, their own volition. There was no requirement, there was no amount. God did not require them to give a sacrifice. They did it of their own volition or their own will. So there was no stipulation. There was no frequency given as to how often they were to give a sacrifice. It was completely of their own free will. Now, later on, then, you have the example of Noah in chapter 8 of Genesis. And in chapter 8, you'll remember that the flood subsides while they are on the ark. And as the flood water subsides, Noah immediately goes out onto dry land to make a sacrifice or to make an offering to God. Verse 20 says, "Then Noah built an altar to the Lord, and taking some of all the clean animals and clean birds, he sacrificed burnt offerings on it." Now again, this offering to God is a completely voluntary offering. There's no command given to Noah. There's no stipulated amount. There's no percentage given. Noah determined in his own heart, of his own accord, what he wanted to offer up to God. It was a spontaneous offering on his part to the Lord. You go even further, and we come to the example of Abraham. And we find that Abraham in Genesis chapter 12 is called by God to be the father or the leader of the Jewish nation. And in response to that, in verse 7, it says that he builds an altar to the Lord. And in offering to the Lord, on the part of Abraham, again, there is no command. There's no stipulation given by God. There's no requirement. Abraham, in response to this promise given to him by God, says thanks to God by the way of an offering. And it's totally by the choice of his own free will. There's no requirement or stipulation by God that he has to do this. In verse 18 of Genesis chapter 13, just a little further on, we read that he does it again. And he builds another altar to the Lord in a place called Hebron. And so it was a voluntary thing, not in response to any command received from God. In any way, shape, or form was it required. So here we have examples of people giving free will offerings to the Lord prior to the time of Moses. And they gave freely of their own possessions out of their love and thankfulness and affection for the Lord. And it was totally spontaneous. You see, this is the pattern of what we call free will giving. Now in Genesis chapter 14, verse 20, this is the first mention of the tithe. And of course, you probably know the story. Abraham had just returned from the slaughter of the kings, the battle of the kings, in verse 17 in the valley of Shaveh. He had been victorious, and he had taken a tremendous amount of spoil or treasure from these kings that he'd conquered. Now you'll remember in the story that on his way back he runs into the king of Salem. And Salem, by the way, is an ancient name for the city of Jerusalem. Now the king of Salem was a man named Melchizedek, who was not only a king, but according to the book of Hebrews in the New Testament, he was also a priest. So he was what we would call a king priest. And it says in verse 18 that he was a king and a priest of the Most High God. So when Abraham sees this man who represents God, he wants to express to God his thankfulness for the victory. So what does he do? Verse 20. And praise be to God Most High, Melchizedek says, who delivered your enemies into your hand. And then it says this, then Abram gave him a tenth of everything. Now, again, it doesn't say that God told him to do this. This tithe or this tenth is not commanded. It was not required by God that he give a tenth to Melchizedek. And it's interesting to note that it doesn't mean that he gave a tenth of everything that he owned. In other words, his entire possessions. Instead, we're told that Abraham gave a tenth of what he took in this battle, the spoils of war. He gave him a tenth of all the spoils that he had received from his victory. Now, we also need to understand that at no time in Scripture do we ever read that before or after this occasion with Melchizedek that Abraham ever gave a tenth again. As far as we know, this is the only time, the only occasion, at least that's recorded, that he ever gave a tenth or a tithe in his entire life. Now, what that confirms to us is really two things. First, that it wasn't a tenth of his income. Secondly, it was given because Abraham chose to do it of his own volition, his own will. Not out of compulsion or because he was required by God to do it, but he gave it simply because he wanted to do it. In fact, Hebrews chapter 7 verse 2 says, Abraham gave him a tenth of everything. The Greek word for everything here is akrathinion. And the word akron means the pinnacle or the top. So akrathinion means the top of the heap and means he gave him a tithe or a tenth of the top of the heap. That's literally what it means. So it wasn't a tenth of this total pile of the spoils. It was more likely a tenth of the top of the pile. So what I'm trying to say to you is this. Maybe all he gave him was a tenth of the best of all the loot that he had taken, and not a tenth of the entire loot. You see, think about it. If he took spoils from all 5 kings and their kingdoms, a tenth of all of that would have been an awful lot for one man, one king, one priest to handle. So maybe Abraham only gave him a tenth of the top of the heap, the top of the best of all the spoils. But the point is, it was a one-time thing. And there's no record that he ever did it this way again. It was given voluntarily, motivated only by the gratitude of his heart. And it was not required of him by God. Well, the next example of giving is found in Genesis chapter 28, where we find mention of the second use of the word tithe in the book of Genesis. And that has to do with the character of Jacob. It's found in verse 22 of chapter 28. And Jacob says this at the end of verse 22. Of all that you give me, I will give you a tenth. Now, please understand that Jacob is making a vow or a promise here in verses 20 through 22. And it says, then Jacob made a vow saying, if God will be with me and will watch over me on this journey I am taking, and will give me food to eat and clothes to wear so that I return safely to my father's household, then the Lord will be my God. In other words, God, if you do this, I will bow down to you and worship you. Now, to be honest with you folks, that's really pretty lame. You see, Jacob was at a low spiritually speaking. He was just so shallow in his relationship with the Lord at this point, and it was really pretty pathetic what he says. You see, what he was doing was trying to buy God off. You know, God, if you'll give me a safe journey and bread and clothing, then I'll let you be my God. I mean, that's really pretty sad, isn't it? That's pathetic. So he says, in fact, God, I'm going to build you a really nice altar here, and I'll give you a tenth of everything I have. Now, when you get to the place where you're buying God off, you're really at a low in your spiritual life as a person, right? I mean, don't take what Jacob does here as the norm for spirituality. Jacob, yes, gave a tenth, a tithe, but he was really trying to buy God off. It really, truly wasn't heartfelt. There's no command that he had to give it on the part of God. In fact, it was completely arbitrary, completely voluntary, with no obligation at all to give the tithe. Now notice, I followed from Cain and Abel right through here to the gift of Jacob, and in every case, these were free, voluntary gifts given of one's own volition, their own free will. The idea that it was a tenth was arbitrary. Out of all the offerings throughout the book of Genesis, twice it happened to be that they gave a tenth, which, as you'll recall from our study last week, in the eyes of ancient people, simply represented the total number and the sense that it was a symbol of giving all, nothing more. Now, as we continue looking at the first period of history, before Moses came on the scene, I want to move on quickly to the next area of how required giving was done. We've looked at free will giving, but what about required giving during this time? What does it say about required giving before Moses comes on the scene? Well, in answering that, I want to look at Genesis chapter 41. You see, before Moses came on the scene, there was required giving of money or of possessions. In fact, most of the time in Genesis, they don't give money at all because their exchange really wasn't cash. It was more like animals or seed or land. That's how they gave. But in Genesis chapter 41, you remember that Joseph was sold into slavery in Egypt by his brothers, and he eventually ends up in jail because he had been accused of sleeping with his master Potiphar's wife. And when the king Pharaoh had a dream that he couldn't handle and understand, and he was upset, they got a hold of Joseph. And you'll remember he comes out of prison and he tells Pharaoh the dream and its interpretation. And he essentially says to Pharaoh there would be 7 years of fruitful crops, followed by a 7-year famine. So Joseph says to the king, to Pharaoh, you better get ready for the famine that's coming. And here's how Joseph suggested they get ready, according to God's plan. Verse 34 tells us, let Pharaoh appoint commissioners over the land to take a fifth of the harvest of Egypt during the 7 years of abundance. Joseph says to him, and this is God's plan, he says, for 7 years, tax the people of Egypt. And you are to tax them at what rate? What's a fifth? Joseph says to take a fifth. It's basically 20%. You see, here is the introduction of taxation into the economy of Egypt. And this is introduced by God through Joseph. You see, this is the first time we find the taxation of a national entity expressed in this way. And you'll notice that we haven't progressed much farther from that even in our modern day, have we? Really, it's still the same measure of taxation today. The norm that Joseph asked for back then is still the basic norm of taxation in America, 20%, except for some unfortunate folks who may be in other tax brackets. But the 20% taxation was the basic rate of taxation in Egypt. This was God's plan as it was expressed through Joseph to save them in the years of famine. And when they collected the 20% through these fat years, the years of abundance, the 7 years of prosperity, that would supply them the needed food for the lean years of famine. So a taxation was instituted at that point, and 20% was the figure or the number. Now I want you to see something else in chapter 47, verse 24 of Genesis. In this same story, later on, it says this, "But when the crop comes in, Joseph says, give a fifth of it to Pharaoh. The other 4/5 you may keep as seed for the fields and as food for yourselves and your households and your children." Basically, things got worse. And so when things really got bad and got worse, Joseph said, now, I'm going to leave you 4 parts. Some to sow back in the field, some to eat, some to take care of your household needs, and some for your kids. But the 5th part, the 20%, goes back to the government. You see, folks, required giving in the Old Testament was 20% on a national level. It was instituted in Egypt, and it became the model for funding of the national government of Egypt through taxation of the people. And it's that same model that we really apply today, even in our modern day. Now, as I conclude, please notice that free will giving is directed toward the Lord. Personally, it comes from us personally in a response of love and sacrifice. But required giving, on the other hand, was given to a national entity, the people of Egypt, the land of Egypt, the empire of Egypt, for the supply of the needs of their nation. That's what you find in terms of free will giving and required giving from the time of creation until the time of Moses. Well, next week, we're going to look at the next period of history from the time of Moses until Jesus comes. And just like today, we are going to look at both free will giving or gifts and required giving. Well, I hope today has maybe been enlightening to you and made you think about giving from a different perspective, or have a better understanding of giving from the time of creation until the time of Moses. Maybe it's not exactly what you thought it was, but I hope that you've seen today that we have been truly biblical in our study of the types of giving, both free will and required giving, during this first period of history. And I look forward to continuing this next week as we see how giving continues to flow in the time between Moses and Jesus. As always, I thank you for being with me today. God bless and have a great week.